And we're back. This is segment 3 of episode 394 of the Colombia Calling podcast, as we're doing a lot of researching and soul searching and thinking about what we could do for episode 400, a big number coming up. But before we reflect on that, let's just say hello to this week's very special guest, Jordan Salama, who's in New York. He's an author, he's a writer, and, well, frankly, he's written a great book, a very readable book called Every Day the River Changes, and it's, well, his journey along the Magdalena River in Colombia. Welcome, Jordan, welcome, and congratulations.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be on Colombia Calling. I'm very excited.
Well, well, of course. But no, listen, it's not anyone who can write a book. It's not anyone who is doing their thesis at Princeton, and then the thesis morphs into a book. Is this how it happened?
That's exactly how it happened. I was given the opportunity to travel for my thesis to do this research, and then one thing led to another, and 3 years after the fact, it's become a book.
It's incredible. I mean, had you thought that I quite want to be a writer. I quite like to get into the travel genre, but it's not that travel genre. But you sort of, had it ever crossed your mind?
Yes and no. It's kind of like a mix between travel writing and journalistic, environmental, novelistic travel writing, and it's hard to describe. When I entered school, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of a writer I wanted to be. And kind of taking courses with different professors who did write for different publications in different styles, I sort of realized that this journey idea was what really grabbed me.
Cool.
But when I wrote the thesis, I didn't think in any way that it would become a book. I actually traveled to Magdalena thinking it was going to be a collection of stories that maybe one or two of them could get placed in newspapers or a magazine or something like that, so I could kind of start a career as a freelance writer. But then I did not imagine that this would happen.
Well, it's amazing, and all power to you. Of course, it's the story and the way you've told it is the success, and that's why. I mean, it's not a jumbled collection of stories, and it's not, of course, it's incredibly coherent, and as I said before, it reads so very well, and of course, it's interesting to me, as you say. I mean, for me, it's obviously my direct interest, but let's start from the thing. Your thesis was to talk about the peace accords. I mean, what were you doing as your thesis that led you to the Magdalena River?
No, so I knew I wanted to write a kind of creative nonfiction journalistic thesis. That was definitely kind of in the cards. And I had done a project the year before, a kind of family history project where I retraced a trade route of my great-grandfather, who was a Syrian Jewish Argentinian traveling salesman in the Andes. So from there, I realized that there were these kinds of journeys that could connect me with kind of disparate people and places along a single route. And I wanted to recreate that, but on kind of a more globally important subject. It was definitely not my plan to write about the peace accords in kind of any specific way, but I had been in Colombia about 4 years earlier, doing some work with the Wildlife Conservation Society and kind of documenting rural conservation projects in different parts of Colombia, and I was fascinated by the country. And when it came time for me to think of an idea for my thesis, I went back into all these like notebooks that I scribbled in when I was there, and I realized that all these people were telling me I had to go back to the Magdalena. How had I not gone that first time? And so I thought, you know what, a river is a great connecting thread. Why don't I just follow a river to try to understand a country in that's changing a lot?
Of course, the river is key to the whole country and the development, let's say, even prior to the arrival of the Spanish. And of course, one of your assistant professors was Rob Carl, who, of course, is he's written one of the great recent books on Colombia, Forgotten Peace. So, of course, I'm sure he was behind and supporting you in this venture.
Yeah, we talked about it a lot. We swapped stories about kite flying because we were we always used to, I came a lot in August and he loves that month because of the kites. So yeah, no, Rob is great and his book is awesome.
It is awesome, and we had him on the show some many years ago now. And Scott, hang on, the little known thing is I won a scholarship to attend a high school in Princeton a long time ago, 1996. So for Americans, that was the Atlanta Olympics. Is the Hoagie Haven still there in Princeton?
The Hoagie Haven is still there with lines out the door. I haven't been since the pandemic started, but it's definitely,
Okay,
you
I'm
want a
glad.
heart attack between two slices of bread, go to Hoagie Haven.
Oh, it was the best. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I'm glad to hear that some things never change, because that was where my companions took me for my, let's say, it was my sort of welcome meal to Princeton Day School. So, back in the day. That ages me a little bit. Let's move on before I get too nostalgic about different times. So this is, I mean, obviously this book is. When was the year? I mean, I read it yesterday, but when was the year that you were actually doing all of this research and the traveling? Was it 2016, 17? It was later, wasn't it?
It was 2018.
Okay,
So
so
actually, a little known thing about this book is that the journey, the 4 weeks, actually occurred in two parts. So it was an interesting challenge to try to stitch together those two separate journeys into one narrative that makes sense. But yeah, so I went May 2018 and August 2018, and actually a lot happened between May and August of 2018. That was interesting. So
tell us
yeah,
about what happened. To give us that background, because a lot of my listeners
well,
are overseas.
yeah. Well, so one I think the most kind of widespread change that I noticed was the Venezuelan migration boom. That was a summer when I think it went up by hundreds of thousands of people in the span of like 2 or 3 months. So much so that when I was traveling in May, I didn't notice it as much as when I traveled in August and met so many Venezuelans living in Colombia and really understood the complex situations those people are facing. And that kind of forms a large part of one of the chapters in my book, in which I spend several days in a town called Estacion Cocorna, one of these kind of forgotten river towns in the middle of the grasslands, that is now filled with Venezuelan migrants who are making a big mark upon that town's existence. And so
Mm.
I wanted that to be a major piece in the book. I wanted, I think that so much of what travel writing can be is bringing in these kinds of perspectives about what goes on in the socio-political context of a place. And so that was what we wanted to do with that.
It's fascinating, and what I listeners to the show will know I've been struggling for more than 10 years putting stuff down on paper. But I want to ask: is that Colombia changes so rapidly? And you're writing about your time with the Wildlife Conservation Society, so WCS, and then you're writing about the Venezuelans. And I was reading it yesterday, and I was sitting there and reading it, going, God, in the time that he must have written that first draft and the time that this has come out, he must have had to have changed so much in terms of the socio-political and the political landscape in Colombia. How did you grapple with this? Because I imagine your editor's going, Jordan, it's changed again, or you're waking up and you're seeing yet another headline, and you're like, oh
Yeah.
God.
Yes, and I mean, far and away, that's the biggest challenge. It's called Every Day the River Changes for a reason, and every day it felt like the book was changing. So, but it is very much, this. It doesn't try to be more than one young person's encounter with a country and a river and its people, right? So at the very base level, that encounter was going to form, like that wasn't necessarily going to change because that trip and those journeys and those encounters were always going to remain. But obviously, the people who I met, the places where I was, lots changed. The biggest and kind of most jarring example is terrible was that well, so I spent a lot of time with social leaders
Mm.
throughout the country, right? And a year after I met the anthropologist, archaeologist Luis Manuel Salamanca in San Agustin, this kind of nationally renowned um, scientist and historian and anthropologist who worked on the UNESCO World Heritage Site up in the mountains there, he was murdered a year after, like almost a year to the day after I met him. And you realize when something like that happens and you're sitting in a place like Princeton working on a project, something like that happens and makes you realize who are the important people in the world. And that had to go in the book, right? That wasn't in the thesis. That wasn't even in the first draft. And of course, then it just radically changed. That entire chapter had to be about Luis Manuel Salamanca and the plight of social leaders in Colombia, because there was simply no other way.
Yeah.
Things have changed for the worse, and things have also changed for the better. I made lifelong friends along that river, and I've heard of people getting degrees and families, making a better life for themselves elsewhere, even if it meant moving from where I first met them. Lots changed. Too much to ever get into deeply, but some things were definitely more jarring than the others.
You became friends with Luis Salamanca. You spent a significant amount of time with him. How were you affected? And because I would say that chapter, it's pretty much the opening, the first major chapter. And I've got a quote here that I wrote down because I found it incredibly insightful. And he says, "What I tell my students now about the peace process is that it's like buying an abandoned farm. You have to put a lot of work into it and then wait for a while, hoping for the results to show." And it's so very insightful. And of course I wrote it down because it meant something to me. You became friends with him, and then a year later you hear, and it was national news. He's a person of note in Colombia. It must have affected you quite profoundly.
Absolutely. That shows you, first of all, so he was a man of few words. When I spent a lot of time with him, but what he chose to say was very guarded and specific. The fact that he said such a thing as profound as that showed me that he felt that the peace process, first of all, was a long game that even maybe he thought he would not live to see the end of, which was very eerie, especially after the fact, given what happened. But when it happened, it was really, it was just terribly sad. I, of course, not only was friends with him, but friends with his friends. And more than anything else, to see how people who've known him for their entire lives were affected by something like this. And also the kind of effect that it has on the morale of people who do similar work. It was terrible. It was the day that I was supposed to defend my thesis, or the day before I was supposed to defend my thesis in front of a panel of professors. And of course, then that entire defense ended up being about, or a lot of it ended up being about Luis Manuel Salamanca. It's just, how can you, living in a place like New York, where we're so lucky, right, where these things just don't happen on a daily basis as it does in Colombia, how can you ever fully understand what it's like? And I feel like that happening was the closest I've ever gotten to fully realizing just the depth of despair of something so terrible like that happening. I just don't have words. I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. It was just awful.
It's too much, isn't it? And it's as you say, it's a daily occurrence here. And I fear that we become jaded to it, especially being here and just people ending up being footnotes, not news anymore, footnotes. And so therein lays the importance of something you write. It's there. It's in print, and it's overseas, and it's in English, and hopefully again my naivety will come through. Hopefully there's something, but I suspect, and you did put it in the book, but again, the difference between the book and the actuality, you did put it in the book that there's been no one. It's total impunity. Are we still in that situation?
From what I understand, yeah. And that seems to be the case with almost all of these social leaders who are killed, is that they promise an investigation and then nothing ever comes through. That's part of the problem.
I've done a piece, it should hopefully come out in the Globe and Mail in Canada shortly, and it's about the report from Global Witness this last week about Colombia being the worst place in the world, the most deadly place in the world for environmental defenders. 65 people in 2020, 64 people in 2019. And I managed to get in touch with some people near to Cali and the families of a gentleman who was killed a few years ago. It's just nothing. I mean, it's just nothing. They find the people who pulled the trigger, but that's not that doesn't solve anything at the end. Okay, you're taking one gun off the street, but how many are there, and who's giving the order? And that tends to be the main issue here, I think. But let's move on. I mean, it's very poignant because you do put that, and you can I kind of knew obviously where it was going, knowing the name, Luis Salamanca. But that's of course me being here and immersed in the situation daily. I kind of knew where it's going, but I think for the lay person or the person with just the general interest in Colombia reading it, it'll hit quite hard. That because it is a quite a poignant moment, and you don't. I'd like to commend you highly on this. It doesn't become verbose. It's very clear. These are clear sentences, and you don't want it. You don't want the 100-word sentence to explain these things, and too many, as we'd say in Spanish, floripondio, like flowery descriptions and so on. We're telling a somber piece of news about a friend of yours. That's the truth. But let's, you move on and you'll go down the river. You're talking about, this is the area of San Agustin, and you keep going down, Onda and so on. But you deliberately, and I think, you pick different towns. You're not picking like this sort of, the obvious places to stop. Now, we need to move over this because it's one of my personal bugbears. It's the hippos around Puerto Triunfo and Puerto Berrio and all this area. Okay, for those of us who are journalists in Colombia, it's our least favorite story because it's come out 1,000 times. And Radio Ambulante, the excellent podcast, their podcast this week is about it as well. And it's just like, again, the blessed hippos. But give us a little bit of a background. I mean, we know they were from Pablo Escobar's farm. Some escaped. This area of the Magdalena, Puerto Berrio, Barranca Bermeja, all of these areas, it's the perfect African climate. And so they flourished. I remember you saw them.
Yes.
That's the difference between you and about 1,000 of the journalists who've written the story. Tell us a little bit about that part of the adventure.
Well, I think that's exactly what I wanted to do to make it different from all of the stories that have come out. They're almost like cartoonish clickbait articles about, oh, look at these drug hippos that are colonizing Colombia. And you're like, this is not giving any insight into what's actually a very complex scientific dilemma that's impacting a lot of people who live there, and fishermen and people who work in the environmental sectors of those towns and those regions. And so I knew that first of all, I knew that it was a big story about the river, and to tell the story about the river today, it's hard to ignore. But I thought, how could I do this in a way that would be sensitive and actually tell a story that is productive and helpful, and not just adding to the chorus of people who are gloating about hippopotamuses because they think that it's funny. So I made a big effort to get in touch with people who are working on solutions to this problem. It doesn't look like there are many feasible solutions. It's a very difficult problem to solve. But as a result, I was able to go out with this kind of cohort of biologists and community leaders and environmentalists from around Estación Cocorná, again, this small town near Puerto Triunfo that I went to, and we saw the hippos. Not only that, though, we spoke with subsistence fishermen and farmers who had, just 2 days earlier, one guy had been chased off of his land by a hippopotamus. So not even in the water, like it was like a cow trying to run him down. So, there's real problems. And then since I went in the 3 years that these hippos have reproduced just in a massive scale. So speaking with conservationists, again, from afar, we're trying to figure out, has one been sighted near Magangué? If so, that's a disaster. And then there's others who are saying they fill some kind of ancient ecological niche. Have you heard about this?
No, go for it. Tell me.
Oh yeah, the details. The details are questioned, but there is a cohort of people who believe that these hippos are replacing large aquatic mammals that were extinct like thousands of years ago. And so actually, there could be a reason why maybe it's fine. We don't need to do anything about it. The overwhelming majority don't believe that. The overwhelming majority believe that something must be done. But anyway, as you can see, very, very complex. And so many of the articles that come out about it get rid of that complexity. I hope that, yeah.
Yeah, as you say, it's the humor of this. I guess you'd say it's this sort of incongruous nature of hippos in South America. But I don't. I mean, it is complex. I don't buy that about the prehistoric, let's say, animals. And what you don't come to a conclusion, which is very careful and clever. Do you have a conclusion on this?
I don't think that I can come to a conclusion because I'm not a biologist. I don't know. It's such a complicated question. It's not a black and white situation.
And
no,
as you
unfortunately, I don't. Yeah.
So very, very expensive to do anything. And yeah.
Well, Richard, I mean, the other thing that's concerning, right? And I know that you believe this, is that it's a wildlife problem in Colombia. There are so many wildlife problems in Colombia. It's the second most biodiverse country in the world, like with all of these landscapes and species that need protecting. Yeah. And it's just sad that so much has to or is going towards these hippopotamuses. So much money, so much time, so much thought, when that could be put, we would hope, to fighting the climate crisis or things like that. But at the end of the day, I mean, it is part of it, and so it needs to be solved.
It's tough. I just want to, I remember, of course, it rang significantly with me the issue of perhaps being spotted by Magangue. I mean, that's where the Cauca and the Magdalena meet. It's the second most important economic center in Bolivar. I mean, it's a serious port for the whole Mojana and that area of the river. If the hippos have got this far, then something drastic is going to be done and has to be done. I mean, Magangue is a stone's throw from Mompox, and then we could have hippos wandering down the Calle del Medio. I mean, again, but that brings us in, and that's trivializing the point, and I didn't mean to do that. But there is a bigger issue here, and I think part of the interest in the story about the hippos is this, and I don't want to say it in a positive way, but it's this aura around Pablo Escobar. And this comes up a lot. And unfortunately, we can't write about Colombia without having mentioned him. There were people equally as bad. There are people equally as bad and as nefarious and cruel, sanguine and all the rest. But he occupies this place in a collective imagination beyond Colombia. And a friend of mine, a Colombian who studies in the UK, has been there for a long time. She said, when I was living in Colombia, we would just yawn with boredom. And it's like, oh God, again, they're doing another film about Escobar. Again, they're doing another book about Escobar. But it took her, I don't know, a decade in the UK to suddenly see it from another vantage point and said, he is a fascinating character. He is, I mean, not taking away from, again, the immense cruelty and bloodletting and so on, but from somewhere. And so we struggle, and especially I struggle being here, but it has to come in. And I guess if you, I don't know, how do you feel on that? I mean, are you somewhat resentful that you had to talk about Escobar? Because we kind of want to talk about Colombia and we want to help Colombia, but at the same time, it's always there, isn't it?
Yeah. I made a very, and I say this in the book, I mean, I made an effort to not as much as possible, because I feel like so much of what is Colombia in the media in the United States is dominated by Escobar. Maybe that's, I mean, solely because of shows like Narcos on Netflix, and that's just what people know. Yeah. But no, I wanted to, as much as possible, show what everyday life is today, like along this river and in this country. And so, yeah, Escobar came in kind of more because of the hippos, and because he's the reason why they're there. But if it weren't for them, I actually may not have mentioned him. I don't know. I don't want it to sound like I was aiming for the book to be incomplete, but I wanted to get past that in order to talk about today.
It's tough, isn't it? It's really tough. And your editor probably would have said, "We got to get some Pablo in there." We got so it's. But anyhow, you did it well, and I think it's the hippos were the key, of course. And then well, you spent time in Barranca Bermeja. And of course, you talk about the heat. Barranca Bermeja is where my wife is from. That's where she was
Really?
born and grew up. And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law. I've spent a fair amount of time there. It's it's not without its charm. The port area I find fascinating. The people are wonderful because they come from all over Colombia working for the big Ecopetrol. But I would say at the end, architecturally and scenically, it's kind of unlovely. That's about the nicest I can say about it. Please, Baramejos, don't kill me. My Colombian team, the football team I feel some affection for is Alianza Petrolera. So there we go. Dreadful team. But I think it's really interesting. You talked about the Pipaton. The Hotel Pipaton. I've stayed in the hotel.
Oh, really?
I've taken groups of English tourists, American tourists from Barranca Bermeja up to Mompox on the river, and we stay until it was closed. And I found it very interesting that the Barranca Bermeja chapter, let's say, or segment of the book really deals with the Pipaton and this fading glory of what is a wonderful hotel. But I think we might have been the last group that stayed in there because it was in such poor state. But you became friends with like the manager, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is right how things happen when you're going on a trip like this. Things happen that you don't expect. I actually didn't even think that I was going to be spending much time in Barranca Bermeja at all. I actually thought it was just going to be a transition point for me to get on a boat to keep going. But when I got there, a taxi driver, he was like, "Where are you staying?" Because I had to get to where I was staying. And this was rare because for the vast majority of the time that I was along this river, I stayed with families in their homes. But I couldn't find somebody in Barranca Bermeja, so I stayed in some hotel. It was like a Radisson or some brand name hotel.
Yeah.
He says to me, "What a shame. If you really cared about the Magdalena and were interested in learning about it, you should stay in the Hotel Pipaton. It's closing tomorrow." And I was like, wow, here's a chance. So the first thing in the morning, I went to the Hotel Pipaton, and who did I find was this man, Oscar Castilla, who was this, very kind guy who, unfortunately for him, had nothing better to do because his hotel was closing like that night to talk to me. And when we started speaking in Spanish, obviously, as all of these interactions were in Spanish, he asked me where I was from, and I said New York. He said, "Oh," in English, "I'm from Queens."
Of course.
Of course. And so then I was like, "Hey, you waited so long to tell me that you're from Queens." So at like 5 years old, he moved to the US with his family. All of his family still lives in Queens, and he moved back because of this various business ventures that then ended up leading him to become the last manager of this fading hotel. And so it just happened to be that I stumbled on the grandest hotel along the Magdalena. Maybe now that position has been occupied by La Casa Amarilla, but the Pipaton kind of held that for a while, and then it was just gone the day that I would be leaving. So I thought, wow, this is just has to be in the story. So I spent some extra time there with him and then moved on after.
It's a great place, and if I could see some way of finding international investment for it, it would just knock the competition out of the water there, and that entry, the sort of opulent entry in the roundabout there with the view over the Magdalena River and the, let's say, the I guess the chimneys burning off the excess gas. There is something really quite scenic about it, although the whole of Barranca Bermeja smells like a burning rubber because of it.
Yes, exactly. But what was weird about the Pipaton was that, it was, again, closing literally the next day, and it felt as though it would be open forever because there were elderly women having aerobics classes in the pool. The restaurant was literally packed with people, like eating. It was like a last supper of some kind, must have been. But no, it just felt like an everyday occurrence in the Pipaton. And you wouldn't have known had you not asked that the next day it would be gone for good.
Yeah, and then you wander down, and it's about 100 meters away is the Core Magdalena office, and it made me laugh. And the Core Magdalena is the sort of like, I don't know, public entity that manages the river, let's say. And you know, I've been in. I'm now work quite well with them, but it's taken 10 years.
I believe that.
It's just, but they're actually pulling their socks up a bit because they have to dredge parts of the river because in 2023 we're getting luxury boats coming down.
Yeah.
So we'll see. They all come up to Mompox now all the time, and anyway, I know them reasonably well. But this whole thing of you waiting an hour and everyone being too busy and no one giving you any out. Yeah, I've been there. I've been in that very office. I think I know the receptionist. You know, you sort of read it. It's like, oh God, I mean, this is so very familiar. But I mean, you move up and you don't have much to say about El Banco Magdalena, and I'm kind of happy about that because there's not a great deal to say about El Banco Magdalena. And you move on to Mompox, and of course, you stay with my suegros.
Yes.
With my in-laws.
Yes.
In my house.
Yes. And it's funny how that happened because, you know, one has to plan a little bit, at least when you're arriving in a place where you will stay. And in Mompox, I did not have a family to stay with. So I was like, okay, I'll make the sacrifice. I'll stay in a hotel. And in my little guidebook, of course, your hotel was like the first one that they were like, you should stay here. So I wandered in, and yeah, no, of course. And it was beautiful. I was like, wow, it'd be great to have this as a base. The very nice man who was working there, and I don't remember his name now, he was like, unfortunately, we're all booked. There's no room, but you know, you might have some luck with Cucci. And I was like, who's that? And he said, here, come, I'll show you. And he called her, and she was like, oh yes, come. And of course I showed up at her beautiful house. She treated me so wonderfully and kindly, and I felt right at home. And then so much so, I loved staying with them so much that I came back to Mompox like a year and a half later to follow up with some research and to do another project, and I stayed with them again. It was great.
I love it, Cucci. I mean, and that's her nickname. So it's my mother-in-law, Cucci. You know what she feels. You see, because she's been so well. Obviously, she's pivotal to everything. Because my mother-in-law is from Mompox and everything else. Nothing would have been possible without her and without the family. That's the truth. For me and my projects and my wife's projects. But she sees someone like you, like, you know, a young man, and she just goes, so young and so far from home, and she wants to just embrace them all. And that's what she says. They've got no one here, and she was mother, because technically speaking, she raised all of her brothers and sisters because her mother was working. And really? So she's her whole life has been one of sort of raising children, and so therefore you would have fallen very much into the category of, oh, this poor boy. So
she said that to me, and I greatly appreciate it, as did my mother. You know, she was like, oh, I'll be your second mother in Colombia, and my mom was thrilled. Because I was 21 when I was going down the Magdalena. It was like I had not had that much experience myself, and it was really nice to have her there. And you know, it's so funny because one thing leads to another, and these meetings turn into other things, right? So it just so happens that her house is right in front of a restaurant that was owned by a woman named Sandra Cure Yunes.
Oh yeah,
Sandra,
yeah,
right?
Sandra.
Right. So you know, my family's from the Middle East originally before they made it to Latin America and the U.S. and so is hers. They're Lebanese. I met her, and then I ended up meeting her parents in Magangue. So I was able to explore Magangue for a while. Crazy place.
Yes.
Yeah. And, you know, so speaking with her, I met her daughter in Barranquilla, who's now a wonderful friend of mine. And it brought into the book this Middle Eastern history, a kind of hidden history, I think, for a lot of people in the US, at least. That maybe wouldn't have been as prominent had I not met people like her. And she showed me where to get kibbeh on a corner in Mompox, and I was thrilled. I was like, my Syrian family made it.
Abajo,
Yeah.
they say, abajo kibbeh. We have, it's a strong, like most of the port Magdalena port towns, and you do bring that in, and of course it brings in your very fascinating family history, the fascinating what was it, Syrian Jews going to Argentina and so on and so forth. But I mean, we can talk about that. But before we move on, there's so many Hasbun, Halili. Who else is there? I don't remember. There's Tokure,
Abuabara.
Yeah, I mean,
All the Turcos.
Yeah, all the Turcos, of course. And of course, you bring in one of my favorite people, Abundio, Samuel Marmol, the musician. And I have to say, we stop, we chat all the time. I've attended some of his drumming. I actually hired him and his son to teach me how to do drumming. Well, it was actually to teach my son, but he wasn't interested during the pandemic and the lockdown because they were earning no money. So it was like, you know what, this is how we'll do it. I who have not one musical bone in my body will take tambor lessons with you, and this is what I'll pay you. And of course it was something. But Abundio played at my wedding. He played
Really?
and I just love that you brought him in. And I will, of course, because I'm going up there in mid-October, I will make sure I pass on the message. And
Please do.
Yeah.
Please do, and show them that you have. I hope you're getting, at least if you don't have it already, the print copy of the book.
It's coming. The print copy is coming from your publisher, and I've bought it as well because in my new hotel I've got a library, and I put all the books in there.
Awesome. No,
Yeah.
thank you so much. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I loved Don Abundio when I met him. I actually can't remember now how that meeting ended up transpiring, as everything blurs. It's so funny. But Mompox is what struck me and continues to strike me is that's one of the most amazing places I've ever been in my life, because it is, well, it's such a musical place. I felt like every time I walked out at dusk, there was some kind of dance that just like happened upon a plaza, or musicians that just kind of met together on a whim to play. And I knew that I had to include that somehow. And the best way to do it was to talk to the master himself. And I went to his house and I saw his drums. He was working outside when I met him. And it also does bring in this interesting bit of the two sides of Mompox, which is a whole other.
Yes, this is something I'm grappling with myself. But this, I love that. And since we've had the restoration of those plazas, and of course you saw them, it has opened up public space to the local people, and therefore we're getting dance practices every night, and you say musical events, and it really is very special. Previous to that, when there was no like sort of nighttime illumination in the plazas, we didn't have it, and it was all very much private and very much reserved, and we didn't feel that magic. And it is something magical around dusk to hear the mapale, the cumbia being played, or in the morning, before it's too hot, because it's soporifically hot, the girls out practicing their dance moves and so on. It's really special. But we can wax lyrically about this, and people will say to me, "Oh, you just did this to promote your place." So we're going to have to move on from that, okay. And we're coming to the last kind of 10 minutes and so on. It's like you've had an amazing success story. Your thesis turns into a book. It's out there. What day does it actually hit the shelves?
November 16th.
Okay, so we're not too long, and I know that my listeners will put it down on Amazon and the other online sales places. You put it down, Jordan Salama, The River. Every day the river changes. This success story has taken you. You've risen like the cream to the top. What's next? But where do you go from here? At what, you're 25?
Well, let's wait for the book to come out. Let's wait for the book to come out first. I feel very lucky, and I think that I didn't necessarily expect any of this to happen. Like the way that this book came about was just crazy. It was my thesis, and I was presenting it as my thesis to a panel of professors. And one guy, a journalist named Jim Dwyer for the New York Times, he passed away also quite tragically about a year ago now. But I will be forever grateful to this man, because I had not met him before, and he came up to me to introduce himself. And he said, "This should not be a collection of stories about a river. This should be a book about the river. And I have the agent who's going to get it published for you." And I was like, wow. And of course, he put me in touch with my awesome agent now. His name's Andrew Blauner, and I'm grateful to him for everything. And then, and we ended up finding Catapult and Mega. And it's just, my editor, she is the reason why this book feels like a unified narrative, and why it aims to be such an empathetic and sensitive story, it's because of her. And so, many people were involved in this becoming what. I don't know what's next is all. I'm making excuses to not talk about what's next because I have no idea.
I think it's about your roots in Argentina. I think there's something Syria to Argentina. I know that people are interested. How does this happen? I mean, don't give away your next book, but how does this happen?
How does how have I become who I am?
No, the migration all the way to Argentina.
Yeah. So my great-grandparents were born in Damascus and Aleppo, Jews in Syria, a community that was extremely working class, and nobody really knows much about, or not much has been written about them. Lots of people know about them, but not much has been written about them. And around the time of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Jews and Christians, basically non-Muslim minorities, were being conscripted for forced military service. Mm-hmm. So there's all sorts of legends around how Salim Salama, my great-grandfather, fled Syria for Argentina, and why he ended up in Argentina in the first place. That's another subject of debate, but he did. Some say when they came to conscribe him to the army, he assaulted the officer who called him an anti-Semitic slur and fled onto a barge that was leaving for Argentina, or for France, and then on to Argentina. Yeah. Anyway, he arrives in Argentina, where my grandfather is born. My grandfather is the second to last of 8 children. He goes, he's the first to get a higher kind of education of any kind. The rest ended up owning textile shops, as most Syrian Jews in Latin America do. But my grandfather went to medical school, and he studied with Che Guevara in the same class of the Facultad de Medicina in Buenos Aires. And for years, he trained as a socialist revolutionary in the mountains in Argentina, until he became disillusioned with the cause and left for New York, where he thought, you know what, maybe I'll have opportunities here. And that's how we ended up here.
So he trained as a revolutionary with Che Guevara in the mountains of Argentina?
Not with Che Guevara. No. That part of the story is a link that.
Okay. But I like the link. I mean, that's a pretty incredible link. They studied together, so he must have seen the ideals coming along, and then he got disillusioned and went to the seat of capitalism.
Exactly. But how does my grandfather Abuelo lives here still. He's 93. He's going to be 93 next month, and he still practices as a doctor. And what does he do here? For almost his entire career in New York, he has had his own office where he sees undocumented immigrants who can't find medical care in English. Wow. Who can't find medical care in Spanish because they don't speak English. So he has his own way. He has always had his own way of being very community oriented in all that he does. So, it's because of him and all the grandparents who laid the foundations for our lives in America that I'm able to do something crazy like this.
I hope you're sitting with him with a tape recorder and getting all of his recollections and memories down, please.
Yes.
Because this is the next book, and I see that clearly there, because it is so very fascinating. And of course, with the Middle East never being far from the headlines for all the wrong reasons, and bringing in South America and then up to New York, it's a family epic, is what it is. It's not just for your family; it's for everyone. And in the great, I would say, the custom of people like Michael Jacobs, Bruce Chatwin, and others. You mention them both in the book, and well, why not? Why not do this? Why not while you're young and you can? Now, we're on YouTube. We're recording this way. Grab the book behind you and show those few people that sign up to see it here. Show what it looks like. Every day the river changes. 4 weeks down the Magdalena. There you go, everyone. If you're only listening to this on a podcast, it's it's got scenery of the Magdalena River and stuff, and you will be able to spot it very quickly in bookstores. We still go to bookstores, everyone, and buy the book. Support a young writer. Do it. It's an interesting book. It's well written, and I've said it 3 times already. It's very readable. You don't get bogged down in the technicalities and the difficulties of the Colombian complexities, of which there are too many. So
thank you.
Congratulations. And I've read it. when the other book arrives, I'll write you a review somewhere. So, or you know, and I will do it. I always do it. And thank you for your time, Jordan. And I wish you all the best with the launch. And of course, it's going to be a success. The fact it's published, that's a success. So, you know, congratulations, and I look forward to the next one. Don't rest on your laurels too long.
Yes. Definitely in something's in the works brewing, and there will be news soon, we hope.
I will share your regards to Kuchi, my mother-in-law, and my father-in-law, and of course to Don Abundio when I see him.
And also, if you do pass by the house of Simon Villanueva, also one of my friends who's no longer with us, if you could say hi to his family for me, his wife and his kids, and show them that he is such a big part of this book. He is somebody who's taught, more than anybody else, I feel like has taught me the value of loving what you do every day. Because he's just the best that Mompox has to offer.
He's one of the family is one of the key filigree silver families, let's say, designers and so on. A huge family, a very important family. Thank you, Jordan. It's been a real pleasure. It's been a pleasure to meet you, albeit over Zoom. And again, as I say, everyone. The book is called Every Day the River Changes by Jordan Salama. I'm saying that right, yeah?
You are.
And please buy it. It's fascinating, and of course, you know, it's an insight into Colombia. So this has been episode 394 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I've been Richard McCall, talking to author Jordan Salama. Thank you to all the new sign-ups on Patreon. That's patreon.com Colombia Calling /Colombia Calling. For as little as $2 a month, you can help support the Colombia Calling podcast and indeed sign up for the newscast reported by journalist Emily Cast, and that newscast arrives, it's Colombia News, to your WhatsApp or your Telegram account and an audio file every Monday. So you get the digested, collated, and interpreted Colombia news. Not so easy in English. So therefore, thank you to all of you who've signed up this last week. And we'll be back next week with more stories or people with something Colombia related. Thank you again, and bye-bye.